All right, there we go. So obviously, let's start with the definition of GDP, right? So GDP stands for gross domestic product, which is essentially, as we said, we've done micro already, now we're in macro. So we're looking at the entire economy as a whole, right? So GDP is essentially the income of the entire economy. Okay. So how much value the economy generates as a whole is GDP. Okay. So mm, okay, so before we get into calculating GDP and all of that stuff, we have a few definitions here. Most of which you should be familiar with already, right? So we've done micro, macro already. We have business cycle. So business cycle refers to the alternating periods of expansion and recession that an economy experiences. And we have two kinds of business cycles essentially. One is an expansion, and the other one is a recession. So expansion is when the economy is growing, so the total production and employment in the economy is increasing, right? So the GDP of the economy would be growing as well. And the other case would be when there's a recession, meaning the economy is in a downturn, so the total production and the employment in the economy would be decreasing. Okay.
Okay.
Another important topic is economic growth, which refers to the ability of an economy to produce increasing quantities of goods and services. So economic growth, oh,
You're good.
wait, am I doing that? No.
No, no, it was accidentally me.
Okay. So economic growth is important because an economy that grows very slowly fails to raise living standards. So in some countries in Africa where little economic growth has occurred in the past 50 years, and as a result, many people remain in severe poverty, sorry. So economic growth. So we'll look at this in more detail, obviously, right? But as we said, when there's periods of recession, the economy is in a downturn. When there's expansion, more people are working, more people are employed, people are making more money, which means that people will be spending more money as well. So all of those things would lead to an economy growing, right? When the economy is in an expansion, everything's moving up. So people are getting richer, people are spending more. So that's what we call economic growth, and that's what obviously every economy strives to do, right? No economy wants to be in recession. You want the economy to keep on growing and all the people in the economy to keep getting better off year after year, right?
Yeah.
Uh, then the next topic is inflation rate, okay, which is simply the percentage increase in the average level of prices from one year to the next. Okay.
Yep.
So obviously this is a very broad term, right? So if you look at particular products, then the inflation rate is going to be different for different products and different services, right? So the way we calculate it, again, we're doing macro. So we're looking at the entire economy as a whole, right?
Right.
So what we do is we sort of create a basket of goods and services, right? So like a variety, as much variety of goods and services that we can include in that basket, the better, right? And then we take the average of all of those to kind of figure out how much more things are costing today compared to 1 year from now, 1 year past, right? Um, so we create this basket of goods and services in all different industries, right? And then see how much they costed 1 year before and how much they cost now, and then the average of that. And then we find obviously the year over year difference in a percentage term, and that gives us the inflation rate. Okay. Right now we're just defining it. Obviously, we'll get into a lot more detail. We'll do problems and graphs and all that, but for now we're just defining these concepts.
Okay.
All right. So now we're actually getting into the GDP. Okay, so GDP measures total production. So we'll look at, let's see. Right. So this is the definition of GDP. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a geographic area during a period of time. Okay, so there are a lot of components in this one statement that we're going to break down in this section. Okay, all of these are very important. So they're very specific and they're very important. So the first term that you see there is the market value. So there's four things, right? And we'll break down each one. So there's market value, there's final goods and services, there's geographic area, and there's period of time. Okay. So those four things we'll break down in this section. So the first one is the market value. Okay. So GDP is measured using market value, not quantities. For example, if you look at number of pairs of shoes that were sold per day, we're not concerned with how many shoes were sold. We're concerned with what's the total value of all the pairs of shoes that were sold per day. Okay, so we're not concerned with the number, we're concerned with the final value of the goods and the services that were produced. So when we're looking at GDP, it is so broad and it's so hard to calculate, as you can assume, because we're going to be looking at every single good and service that every single person in the economy produces, okay, everything that's of value. And we're going to add up the value of all of that, and that's our GDP essentially, right? So obviously very hard to calculate. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources to calculate, right? But that's our first part is we're going to look at market value, not quantities. Then the second part of the definition is the final goods part. Okay. So we're only concerned with the value of the final goods and services. Now, what do we mean by final goods and services? Final goods and services are goods and services that are ready for consumption, essentially. Okay. So for example, if you look at any good, let's say you look at a tablet. Okay. So when you look at the production process for a tablet, like an iPad, there's a lot of components that go into it, right? So there's the actual screen of the tablet, everything that goes inside of it, the chip, all of that. So when we look at the GDP, for example, and we're calculating the value of these tablets that were sold, we're going to look at the final product only. Okay. So once the tablet has been created, that is the only thing that we'll look at the value for. Okay, so we're not gonna look at the value of the display by itself, then the value of the chip by itself, then the value of all the parts inside by themselves, and then add everything up. We're not gonna do that. We're only concerned with the value of the final good. Okay, so once everything has been assembled, and it's the main key point is that it's ready for consumption. Okay, so you can hand it over to the consumer and they can use that product, right? Once the product is in that form, that is what's called a final good. Okay. And then same thing with the final service. And the services is ready to be delivered, right?
Right.
So the example that I gave, right, the display, for example, would be an intermediate good. Okay. So it's not ready for consumption yet. Okay. So there's still stuff that needs to be added to it to make it a final good. Okay. So the example that they give here is car seats. So this is a good example as well. So car seats by themselves are going to be considered intermediate goods, right? Once they're installed in the car and the consumer can actually use them, that's when they're a final good. Okay, so so whenever you're differentiating between intermediate and final good, right, which you definitely can get a question on this on your exam as well, on your test.
Yeah.
The main question you're asking yourself as you're reading the question, right? The thing you're asking yourself is this good ready to be consumed? Can the consumer take it and use it right away? If the answer is yes, then it's a final good. If not, then it's an intermediate good. Yeah.
Okay.
So the reason we do that is to avoid the problem of double counting. Okay. Because if we were to take the value of the intermediate goods and the value of the final goods, then we're essentially double counting the production of the economy. Okay. So the value of in my example, the value of the display that's in the tablet is already included in the price of the tablet, in the value of the tablet. So that's why we don't count it twice. We only take the final good. Okay. So if we go back to our definition, that was the second part, right? So we did the market value part, then the final goods and services part. The next thing is GDP includes only current production. Okay, so GDP includes only production that takes place during the indicated time period. So whenever you're going to be given a problem, right, where we're discussing GDP, there's always going to be a clear time period stated. Okay, so when we're doing these calculations, when we're finding um, our GDP or the value of final goods and services, we're only going to be
Yeah,
looking at that specific period of time. Anything before and after that is not going to count. Yeah.
good. Sorry if my computer's shifting around. I'm actually sitting under my covers right now because I left my windows open last night. So it was probably close to -5 in my room this morning.
Wow.
So
Well,
a
that
little
was not a
chilly.
good idea.
All right.
All right, you good to go?
Yep, all good.
Okay. So we have an example here of calculating GDP.
Hmm.
So given the production and the price per unit of four goods, and obviously for simplicity, we're assuming that only these four goods are being produced in this economy and nothing else. Okay. So if they ask you to calculate the GDP for this economy, what would you do?
So you have your time frame.
Right.
Quantity. What's the formula again?
So, I mean, you don't even need a formula, right? So when we're looking at GDP, as we said, you're only concerned with the market value of the final goods and services. So we're not concerned with the quantity, we're only concerned with the market value. So for example, if you look at
The
running
price per
shoes,
unit?
right? So for running shoes, the economy produces 100 of them. That doesn't matter when we're calculating GDP. What we need is the how much those 100 shoes are worth, which would be 100 times what each shoe is worth, which is 50, right? The
Okay.
$5,000. That's the price, that's the market value of running shoes. And then you do the same thing for the rest of the three
And then you
goods,
add
and
them
then
all together.
right, and that would be the total value of the final goods and services that this economy produced in the year 2022, which would give us the GDP for this economy for the year 2022. Okay. Okay, so that's what we do. Now, one thing to see here is so what we did is fine, right? Now, one thing you need to keep in mind is the intermediate goods that we discussed, right? So if you look at textbooks and paper would be an intermediate good for textbooks, right? We use paper in the production process for textbooks. So if we've already included the market value of textbooks in the GDP, then if we include the value of the paper as well, then that would be double counting, right? So if we're
Right.
including the value of textbooks, then we exclude the value of paper, okay? Because the value of paper is already included, because the producers who are manufacturing textbooks, they've already paid for the paper, right? So that's
Yeah.
already been accounted for in the price for the textbooks, right? So
Right.
that's why we're not going to include the value for paper in that, okay? So that's excluded out of the GDP.
Okay.
Okay, so you just multiply each one, add the values up, and that's our GDP for the year 2022.
Awesome.
Okay. Okay, so this is something called the circular flow of GDP.
Okay.
So, I mean, this might look super complicated at first, but it's really not. Um, it's just sort of a visual representation of how the economy sort of works, right? So if you look at, so let's look at households and the firms. So let's look at just the middle part of it. So households, governments, and the household, government, and the firms, excuse me. Okay. So when you look at households and firms, we're looking at how goods and services essentially move in between them. So if you look at households, households provide labor services to the firms, right? So when firms are producing for the economy, right, we're looking at the value of these final goods and services that they're producing. They almost always they're using some form of labor for it, right? And the labor is being supplied by households. So households supply firms with labor, and firms in return pay them wages, interest, and transfer payments, right? That arrow that you see going from firms to the households, right? So when firms pay them, which is their salaries, for example, right? So when let's say you work for a company, they pay you a salary, then you take that salary and you spend it on consuming more goods and services, right? In your day-to-day life. So that money that the firm gives to the households is then spent a portion of that. Obviously, you don't spend 100% of your income, right? A percentage of the money that you get, you spend on consuming more goods and services, and that money goes back to the firms, right?
Right.
So that's our flow. And in between, you have the government acting as an intermediary, right? So they charge taxes both ways. So when the firms pay you, right, there's an income tax there. And then when you get your money after tax, you spend that money, and then you're paying taxes on that again, right? On the expenditure taxes. So you have the government acting in between there. And then on the outside of the circular flow, you have the rest of the world, and you have the financial system. So in the rest of the world, we're just looking at exports and imports, essentially. Okay. So from rest of the world to the firms, you have exports, and then from rest of the world to the households. So the house from the households to the rest of the world, you have imports. So when households are buying foreign goods and services, then that would be imports, right? And when the firms are selling our domestic goods and services to the rest of the world, then that would be exports, right? So exports is when our domestic producers are selling their services to the rest of the world, right? To foreigners. And then imports would be when our domestic buyers or consumers are buying foreign goods and services, right?
Right.
So that's the interaction with the rest of the world. And then the final piece there is the financial system, which we sort of a portion of it we discussed already, right? The payments of wages, interest, and rent and profit from the firms to the households. The only part missing is the savings and the borrowings. So as we said, when households receive payments, the salaries from the firms, they spend a percentage of that in their expenditure on goods and services, and the rest you're going to save, right? So whatever you don't spend, you save. So that those savings go into the financial system, right? Into the banking system, and then the banks use that money to lend more money out to the firms for them to produce more goods and services, invest in machinery, capital to be able to produce more. And then when they produce more, they hire more people, and then the people get more salaries and they spend more money. You understand? So there's just a big circle going on, right? Of goods and services and money and everything just flowing from households to consumers to government to the banking system, and it just keeps happening every single minute, right?
Okay.
So that's the circular flow and the sort of the movement of the GDP in the economy. Okay.
Yep.
Any any questions so far?
No, we're all good so far.
Okay, so in the previous section, we've defined what GDP is, right? We looked at in an example what it looks like in terms of calculating it. And then we looked at the circular flow of the GDP as well, how the money and goods and services flow in an economy. And now we'll look at different approaches of actually calculating the GDP. So first approach we've already looked at, right, which was just taking the final the market value of final goods and services, right? The example that we did with the shoes and all of those four things. So that was one way. So there's two more approaches. Okay, one is an expenditure approach and the other one is an income approach. So in the expenditure approach, we're basically going to look at all the spending on domestically produced goods and services. Okay, so every single good and service that every single service providers, firms, households produce, the value of all of those. Okay, so the key part here is domestic. We're not concerned with anything that's relating to the rest of the world. We're only going to look at domestically produced goods and services. And then in the income approach, as the name suggests, we're just going to look at all the income that's received by our residents, right? So Canadians, as the result of production that takes place in Canada. So in both the cases, we're only concerned with the domestic value generation. Okay, so we're not concerned with exports and imports, for example. We're only going to look at the value of goods and services that are produced domestically.
Still listening, I'm turning my camera off because I just need to blow my nose, okay?
Yeah, you good.
You're good to continue, just as a heads up if you need to.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is the income approach, as we said. Okay, so now we're going to actually break it down into four sections. And so the four categories, which we break down income into, is compensation of employees, gross operating surplus, gross mixed income, and taxes minus subsidies. The first one is the biggest one is compensation of employees. Okay, so which is this makes up the single largest element of GDP in the income approach, usually at 50% of the GDP. It's simply the wages and the taxes that are paid out to the employees of the firms, right? So obviously, that's the biggest piece of the income approach, right? Because most people are working for other companies, and the income that they receive in return, right? The compensation of the employees, that's the biggest piece of the income that the entire economy earns as a whole, right?
Right.
So compensation of employees. The next one is gross operating surplus, which means the payments made to the owners of capital by firms and government for the use of their capital in producing goods and services. In 2021, gross operating surplus was 27.7% of GDP. So usually the second largest component of the GDP. Okay, so this is further broken down into three elements. So we have net operating surplus of corporations, consumption of fixed capital by corporations, and consumption of fixed capital by governments or non-profit organizations. Okay, so we'll just look at each one of those three. The first one is the net operating surplus. It refers to the payments to the owners of capital over and above the compensation for the consumption of their capital. Okay, so we're talking about physical capital here. Okay, so the first part that we looked at, the payments to the employees, right? So that's essentially okay. So when we're looking at, so this is the income approach, right? So basically, we're looking at all the factors of production and how they get paid. So if you remember in chapter one, we did the four factors of production, right? The land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So we're basically going to look at each one of those and how, like, what return do they get? So the first part that we did here, the compensation of employees, this is basically the return for employment, right? So land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So in those four, this is the return for labor, right? Now, the second one that we're looking at, gross operating surplus, this is basically the return for capital. So for example, when firms invest in capital, let's say they buy a new machinery, okay? So the return on that machinery would be the net operate would go into this net operating surplus bucket. Okay, so we're basically looking at different forms of capital right? Could be monetary capital as well as physical capital. So it could be land that the company is investing in. It could be machinery that the company is investing in. It could be loans that the companies are giving out, right? So all of those things would fall under the bucket of capital, and all the return that they're getting on that investment is an income, right? So that income needs to be included in the GDP. So that goes in this uh, gross operating surplus bucket. Right now, we're looking at net operating surplus. Okay. So the first one is consumption of capital. So consumption of capital essentially refers to depreciation. So capital, machines, buildings, and so on wear out a little bit with each use. For example, every time you drive a car, the gears and the brakes wear down a little bit. If you let someone else use your capital, you have to be paid for this wear and tear. So net operating surplus is what the owners of capital get paid over and above compensation for the depreciation of their capital. Okay. So when they, for example, if we look at the machine example, so when a company invests in a piece of machinery, every single year it's going to go through wear and tear, right? So a percentage of that machine that they invested into is going to depreciate every single year, right? Let's say you buy a machinery, it's going to last 10 years. So that means that every single year it's going to depreciate 10%, right? So
Right.
since they're investing that money, they're essentially losing that 10% every single year. The return that they get on that for that investment, right, above the depreciation, let's say they're losing 100,000 every single year for operating that machine, but in return they're making $150,000 every single year. So that profit that they're making, the income that they're making, the 50,000, is what would go in this bucket of net operating surplus. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, so that was our first part here, the net operating surplus. Then the second part is the consumption of fixed capital by corporations. So that refers to the depreciation of capital that occurs while that capital is being used by firms. And then the last one is the same thing, but just by government and nonprofit organizations. So when the government is investing into projects, right? Let's say the government is building a new highway, right? So that's an expense. And then the return that's generated on that, for example, the tolls that they're collecting from that highway, that the income from that would go in this bucket. Okay, so basically we're just looking at, so I mean, I wouldn't say this is too important. You just need to remember these terms, right? For example, if they, I mean, if there's a table that you're given and you're supposed to calculate gross operating surplus from those, so you need to know what terms you add up to get gross operating surplus, essentially. Okay, so I wouldn't say it's like you don't need to go into too much depth here, but you
Okay.
should know what terms mean and how you would calculate gross operating surplus given these terms. Like you should be able to identify these terms and know that, okay, these are the terms that you're gonna use to calculate gross operating surplus, for example. Okay.
Right.
Um, so another term we have here is gross mixed income, which covers the income generated by small businesses. Okay, so this is a pretty big chunk of the GDP as well. It was 11.9% in 2021. Okay, so these payments get mixed together as the payments to owners of a small business. So the reason it's called mixed is because so we're looking at small businesses. So the owners of these businesses often work there as well, right? So a lot of their income essentially is their salary because they're trading their time for it. Uh, that's why it's mixed because it has that the salary component as well, but they're working technically for themselves, right? So that's why we
Right.
categorize this as just mixed income. Okay, so this would be for small businesses, not for like giant corporations.
Okay.
And then the last piece is taxes minus subsidies. So the reason we're adding that is because this is an income for the government, right? So the government collects taxes from all sorts of things. So those taxes by themselves are income for the government minus the subsidies, which is the expenses for the government, right? The subsidies that the government gives out. So taxes minus subsidies gives you the net income of the government, right? So that
Right.
is also included in the GDP when we're looking at the income approach. Okay, just going back,
Okay.
we started this whole thing with two approaches, right? So we had the expenditure approach and the income approach. So right now we looked at the income approach. So basically, we're just trying to piece together the income of every single uh, agent that's working in the economy. Okay, so we looked at the income of the employees, we looked at the income of the firms, essentially the capital that the firms deploy, and then we looked at the income of small businesses and the income of the government, which is the taxes minus the subsidies. So the income of all of those components essentially gives us the income for the entire economy, which is a good um, another alternative way of calculating the GDP. Okay, so how much income everyone gets is a good proxy for how much every single good and service was worth, which was the first way that we calculated GDP, right? Is just the value of goods and services. So this is another way of calculating it. And then the third and the final way of calculating the GDP is the expenditure approach. Okay. So in this, again, we have four categories, which is the final consumption, gross fixed capital formation, investment in inventories, and net exports. So the first category is final consumption. So similar to uh, what we did in the previous section, right? The value of all the final goods and services. So the final consumption expenditure captures all the domestic purchases of goods and services used to satisfy individual or community needs and wants. So the key
All right.
part here is domestic. Okay, so if you look at the four pieces that we discussed above, we have a net exports section at the end, right? So that's what's going to cover our interactions with the rest of the world. So that means in the first three buckets, we're only going to look at domestic expenditure. Okay.
Okay.
So this is obviously the biggest chunk of the GDP. It was 77% in 2021, is
Yeah.
basically every single dollar that's being spent in the economy on buying goods and services. Okay. So obviously that's going to be the biggest portion of it. Then the next component is gross fixed capital formation. So so you'll notice throughout this chapter, we're using these terms gross and net, right?
Right.
So gross is sort of the just so if you look at revenue and profit, for example, so revenue would be gross and profit would be net. Okay, so whenever we're looking at gross, we're just looking at for example, all the money that's coming in, and then once we subtract our expenses from it, then you end up getting net. Right? So gross fixed capital formation is the purchases of fixed assets by firms, governments, and households. So since we're in the expenditure approach, right? We've already done the income approach. We're in the expenditure approach. So we're just gonna look at the same way that in the income approach, we looked at the income of every single segment of the economy. Now we're gonna look at the expenditure that's being made by every single component of the economy. So we looked at the people first, the consumers. That's the biggest component of the expenditures, obviously. Now we'll look at basically the firms and the governments. So what they're spending on fixed assets or capital. So fixed assets are tangible goods that will provide benefits over a long period of time and cannot be easily converted into cash. So fixed assets are things like buildings, including residential houses, and machinery that firms will use
Okay.
to create more products and provide more services. Okay. So expenditure on fixed capital will be gross fixed capital formation. Businesses accounted for 82% of all fixed capital formation, which makes sense because we're including all the machinery that uh, all the capital that they invest into, right?
Yeah.
And the third one is investment in inventories. So inventories would just be whatever the firms produce minus what they've sold. Okay. So
Okay.
everything that the firm produces, you subtract everything that they sold, whatever's left over would be their inventories. So that's a form of expenditure for the firms as well, right? Because they've already invested into producing that, but they haven't sold it yet. So it's an expenditure for them. So that's our third component of the expenditure approach. And the final one, as we said, all three of those ones before were domestic. So now we're going to add in our final piece, which will cover the rest of the world, which would be exports and imports. So net exports are the value of a country's total exports minus its total imports. Okay, so exports are goods and services, as we discussed already, that our domestic producers sell to foreign governments, households, and firms. And imports are goods and services that are produced in foreign countries that are being purchased by our domestic firms, governments, and households. Okay, so we subtract the value of the exports. So you subtract the value of the imports from the exports, and that gives us our net exports. And that's the final piece in our expenditure approach. Yeah. And with all of these, as we discussed, it's very hard to calculate, right? Like if you imagine realistically finding out the value of every single, if you look at income, every single dollar that every single person, every single firm, every single department of the government earned, it's very hard to do, right? So there's obviously going to be discrepancies. It's never going to be fully 100% accurate. So we always allow for uh, a certain level of statistical discrepancy in that, okay, whenever we're calculating these.
Right.
All right. We only have about like 15 minutes left, so let me just skim through and cover the most important parts. Mm. Okay, so this right here is very important. Right, this is going to form the foundation for a lot of the analysis that we'll do moving forward. This equation right there. So y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. So this is basically our formula of calculating GDP using the expenditure approach. Okay, so y is our defines the GDP, right? So the total essentially income or expenditure of the economy is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx. So C stands for consumer spending. I stands for investment spending by the firms. G stands for government spending. And then NX stands for net exports. So we're basically dividing the economy into these four components. So C represents the consumers, right? So all the money that the consumers are spending on consuming goods and services. The second component is I, which is essentially the firms, right, of the private sector. So all the money that the firms are spending on producing goods and services, all the money that the firms are investing, right, the investment expenditure by the firms to produce more goods and services. The third one is the public sector or the government. So all the money that the governments are spending domestically. And then the final piece is the net exports, which is the exports minus imports, which covers the interactions with the rest of the world. Okay, so adding up all of these gives you the total expenditures by the economy, which is a proxy for the GDP, right? So this equation we're going to be using a lot.
Okay.
Okay, but this we have to cover as well. I think you should see at least at least one question on this on the value added method on your test. So this is another way of calculating GDP. Um, so it's very much related to the intermediate and the final goods that we discussed before, right? So intermediate good, as we said, are goods that are still they're not ready for final production. Sorry, the final consumption, right? So intermediate goods are converted into final goods, and then the final goods are the ones that are ready for consumption by the end consumer, right? So the what we're doing here essentially is as we go through the production process, we're instead of calculating the value of the final good or service, we're going to look at the production process and as so we'll look at all those intermediate goods that are being produced and how much value gets added through each step of production. And we'll just take all those value addeds, add them up, and that we'll use that instead of just taking the final value. Okay, so as we'll look at the example, it'll make more sense. So a value added refers to the additional market value of a firm. Sorry, it refers to the additional market value a firm gives a product and is equal to the difference between the price the firm paid for the intermediate goods and the price for which it sells the finished products. So let's look at an example. Okay, so we're looking at basically the production of a diamond. Okay, so it starts from a diamond mine. The value of raw diamond that they extract is worth $500. Okay, so they're extracting that value basically from scratch, right? So that $500, that entire value is being added by the diamond miner, right? They add $500 to the value of that diamond because they're extracting it from scratch, right? Now that diamond, once it's been extracted, goes to the gem cutter. Okay. Now the gem cutter, let's say, buys that diamond for $700. Okay. Or sorry, once they cut the diamond is worth $700. So before the diamond got to the gem cutter, it was $500. Once they add their service to it, right? They cut the diamond using their expertise, then it becomes worth $700. So that gem cutter adds $200 of value to that diamond, right? Then the next phase is that cut diamond goes to the jewelry designer and they produce a diamond set with it. And that set is worth $1,000. So now that cut diamond is worth, which was worth 700. Now, once the designer has added now their value add, which is designing the diamond into a set, now it's worth 1,000. So they've added $300 of value to the diamond, right? And then in the final step of the process is it goes to the jewelry store to be actually sold to the end consumer, right? And it's being sold for $1,500. So the value added by the jewelry store to that Sev diamond is now $500. Okay. So
Okay.
so in the first section that we did, if you remember, when we just multiply the price and the quantity of the final goods and services and just added them up to calculate the GDP, right? If we did that with this diamond ring, we would have just taken the diamond ring because that is the final product, right? We would have ignored everything else before it, just looked at the diamond ring, how much it's worth, and that's what we would include in the GDP, right? Which would be $1,500. Now, in the value added approach, what we're doing, as we said, we're looking at the value added at each step of the production process. So the 500, the 200, the 300, and the 500, we add all of those up, and that gives us 1,500 as well. Okay, so we could either take just the value of the diamond ring, the face value, which is 1,500, or we could use the value added approach and add the values that are added by each step of the process, and then add them up to get uh, the same answer, right? Which is the $1,500. So this is another way of calculating GDP.
Okay.
Okay, this we need to cover real GDP versus nominal GDP, GDP deflator. Okay. I mean, yeah, we have about 5 minutes left, so let's try and cover the most we can.
Okay.
The rest we can do if we do another session on the weekend.
Sure.
Uh, okay, let's start here. So we have real GDP versus nominal GDP. Um, okay, so nominal GDP is calculated by summing the current values of final goods and services, whereas real GDP is calculated by designating a particular year as the base year, and then using the prices of goods and services in the base year. Uh, okay, so when we calculate GDP, as you know, we do essentially how much the quantity of the good times the price, right? So nominal GDP is when you take the prices of the current, so the quantity is always going to be the current year, right? The prices, if you use today's prices, then it's nominal GDP. If you use the prices of a base year, meaning a different year from today, right, a year before or 2 years before or whatever, then we call that the real GDP. Okay, so once we look at an example, it'll become more clear. So here, so suppose that a very simple economy only produces the following three final goods and services: energy drinks, pizzas, and textbooks. We use the information in the table below to compute real GDP for the year 2023. Assume that the base year is 2012. So let's calculate the nominal GDP first. So today we're in the year 2023. Okay. So the nominal GDP would be what? You would take the quantity that you produce of each good in this year times the price and then just add them up, right? That's going to be how much each of those goods, the total production of each of those goods is worth today, right? So 100 times 50 plus 80 times 10 plus 20 times 100, right? That's going to be the nominal GDP for 2023. Now, what they're asking for is the real GDP. So what we do is, as we said, the quantity that we use is still going to be 2023, okay? Because we're calculating the GDP for 2023, meaning we'll use that third column, right? The 100, 80, and 20. But instead of multiplying that with the prices 50, 10, and 100, which are the prices for 2023, we will use the prices of 2012, which is the 40, 11, and the 90. Okay.
Okay.
So you would do 100 times 40 plus 80 times 11 plus 20 times 90. And that would give you the real GDP, assuming that the base year is 2012. Okay.
Okay.
So pretty straightforward. And then just add them up. So I would say the only point where students usually mess up is when they're asked for the real GDP, then they'll use the quantity of the base year as well. Okay. So that's the main point to keep in mind. The quantity that you use is always going to be today's year's quantity. Okay. So the only thing that we're changing is the price when you go from nominal to real.
Okay.
Mhm. Um, okay, let's just look at the deflator quickly, and then we can call it for today. I think that's pretty much completes the chapter.
Okay.
Uh, so GDP deflator. So this is something. It's a measure of the price level. So the way it's sort of so it's related to the price level and the inflation. You're essentially using it to calculate the inflation from one year to the next. So the formula for GDP deflator is nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So if you look at this example that we just did, right, when we go from nominal to real GDP, as we said, we're taking the prices from the current year to the base year when we go from nominal to real, right? So we're going from 50 to 40, 10 to 11, 100 to 90. So you're essentially looking at the price difference in the 2 years, right? When you're calculating that. So the deflator is just going to make that super obvious and show you how much the prices changed from one year to the next for the same quantity of the products, right? Which is how you calculate inflation. So let's take a look here. Okay, so you're given the nominal GDP. So that's how the question will usually be structured, right? You're going to be given the nominal GDP and the real GDP for 2 years, and you're going to be asked to calculate the GDP deflator for either one of the years or both the years. Okay, so you're given the nominals for both, the reals for both. Now, how would you calculate the GDP deflator? So if you look at 2019, right? So GDP deflator is the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. Okay, so the nominal GDP, so the 2019, the 2311 divided by the 2125 times 100. Okay, so you do that and you get 108.8, which essentially implies that there's been an 8.8% increase in price for the same products and services from 2019 to 2020,
Right.
right? And then for
Okay.
2020, you do the same thing, 2206 now divided by 2023 times 100. So you get 109, which essentially implies a 9% increase. Okay, so from these values for the GDP deflator, we can calculate the price level rose. Now, if you compare the deflators for the 2 years, you can see that so there's a 0.2% increase in the price levels from 2019 to 2020. Okay.
Right.
So I would say the the value added, the GDP deflator, you should get one question each on those.
Okay.
And one other thing, right? The well, the equation, so the y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, we're going to be using that a lot. But from this chapter in particular, there's not a lot of content there to be like to frame many questions.
Right.
So I would say those are the most important things. And then yeah, just take a look at the questions that your prof assigned for the last chapter as well as this one, right? So you didn't get to do the last chapter. Um, and then yeah, just let me know if you have any like if anything isn't clear, anything you want to go over again.
Okay.
And yeah, you have one more chapter left then, right? For the midterm
Yes.
test. Which one was it? Chapter 5. My God, it's lagging so much.
Yeah, it's slow. Everything's slow this morning.
Uh, yeah. I mean, it's up to you. Uh, this chapter's probably we haven't done chapter. We have the PPF. We haven't done either, and we have this left.
Okay, so
We
I
could probably
think that a
do it
session
in.
this weekend would be very beneficial because I do have that test on Monday.
Yeah.
So just going over it, I think would be good. I'll try and use the Calendly. But just in case it does not work, if I have technical difficulties, is there a certain day or time that works for you best? Best for you?
Uh, I mean, so if you go to the link, you can see my availability as well. So any of those
Yeah, okay.
times. I
I'm
mean,
in the
this
link.
time just goes. Um, but yeah, this time usually works for. Yeah, it should be fine for both days, for Saturday and Sunday, whatever you want to book.
I'll probably be doing Sunday at 8:30 because I'm going home tomorrow, so
Okay.
that'll be
Yeah, someone else reached out to me about Sunday as well. I forgot what time.
okay. It seems
I think they
oh,
like the in-person students have a test as well, I think on Monday.
oh, okay. All
Yeah.
right.
Um,
I'll see what I can book. We'll see if they are they using Calendly as well?
yeah, yeah. That's why I want to use it just so like there's no conflicts, you know?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so she said 9 to 11 on Sunday.
Okay. Sounds
Mm.
oh then maybe I'll
Do
there'll be
to
too much
9 or 12.
overlap. Pardon?
Yeah. If you want to do like 8 to 9 or 11 to 12, then I think that should be fine. That would be
Oh,
best.
okay, sounds good. I'll see what fits in my schedule best. And book the session in.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
All right.
I'll send you the recording for this one as well.
All right, and
And yeah, I'll see you Sunday.
I'll send the payment over right now.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you so much. Have a good
No
day.
worries. Bye bye. Have a good day.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.